I am Jonathan Humphreys. Welcome to the HoCoSo Conversation.
I would like to start by saying this is an absolute privilege to be in conversation with Mr. Alphy Johnson. Alphy Johnson is a legend within the hospitality industry. He has had an incredible career. And during this time of crisis that we are currently facing ourselves, we look to others for inspiration. And although we've never had this kind of situation for many of our leaders and many of us as industry professionals, the opportunity to have a conversation with Alphy Johnson about some of the crisis that he has faced in his career is invaluable. He describes himself as the humble innkeeper, which is really not a true reflection of the amount of responsibility and the amount of ability that he has shown. In the next podcast that you are about to listen to, I am going to talk to Alphy about his time during the San Francisco earthquake and the Los Angeles riots. They are two events that are marked in history as major crises. They didn't last a significant amount of time by themselves, but they had significant impact to the community, to the city, to the tourism sector. And they also impacted them in a way that took time for those markets to recover and for the people to recover. And the other aspect to this is that at the time when leadership was all around command and control and charisma and being on stage and kind of selling a message, his management and leadership style now seems extremely relevant and was not in tune with the typical leadership styles of the time. And yet he was highly regarded, highly respected by his colleagues, by his friends, by his network, and by his community. The podcast you're about to hear is the insights into these events, and I hope that you enjoy this podcast as much as I enjoyed having this conversation with Alphy, the humble innkeeper. I think I'll leave it up to you to make up your own mind. So without further ado, I'm going to let you listen to this wonderful podcast, and please leave your comments below. Thank you very much. We look forward to engaging with you in future podcasts by HoCoSo Connect. First up, I would really like to say a big thanks to Alphy Johnson, who is our special guest here today. And
my pleasure.
Alphy, it's a real pleasure to have you on the show. You've had so much richness and diversity in your life, and at the same time, you've been through many challenges and many crises from a professional perspective. Given what's going on today, we thought it was timely to kind of have discussions about leaders that have been through other challenges and how, even though they've been through those challenges, that thought process and that style of leadership is also relevant going through the crisis today. So without kind of giving too much away to the audience, Alphy has had an amazing experience over the years. We're going to touch on some of his experiences in, for example, the earthquake in San Francisco, the Los Angeles riots, post 9/11 in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. So I thought, Alphy, first of all, I think for the audience, it would just be kind of helpful to kind of give them a sense. We're going to move up to kind of 1989 in San Francisco, but just to kind of give the audience some context, how you arrived at 1989 in San Francisco. So obviously you're in the hospitality industry. That's kind of why we're doing this, kind of talk about the kind of impact on hospitality and leadership in hospitality. But if you could kind of give them a little bit of background, that'd be great, Alphy.
Certainly. No, I was in San Francisco because I was hired to be the executive assistant manager at Hotel Nico San Francisco. a recently opened hotel. I'd previously worked for Rosewood and some other luxury companies and been involved in some startups. But again, this was my first venture into a large hotel. I mean, we had over 600 rooms. So, and it's a large convention hotel, again, located in the heart of San Francisco, major U.S. city, a city that has a history of earthquakes. When I tell people that, I was there during the San Francisco earthquake, I quickly qualify, not the one in 1906. I wasn't around that long ago, but the one in 1989. Again, this is the crisis that we were most prepared for, because people in San Francisco prepare for earthquakes.
One of the things that our readers may not be so familiar with is the actual earthquake itself. I mean, obviously it's 1989. I was just wondering if you can kind of give a bit of context to why this particular earthquake stood out amongst all the other earthquakes that occurred in San Francisco. As you mentioned, San Francisco is on a fault plane. Therefore, the likelihood of earthquakes has always been relatively high. But why was this one so different from all of the others, apart from the one in the early 1900s that you mentioned?
And in San Francisco, you get used to earthquakes. I mean, they happen, maybe it's a 3.5, which you will feel, or lesser, which you'll only feel if you're lying in bed. But, this was a 7.2. And for every point of increase, it doubles in magnitude of the shaking. So the 7.2 will not just wake you up, it'll throw you out of bed, just to give you some context. And it happened about just about 5:10 in the afternoon. And this one lasted seemingly forever. But, I was sitting at my desk. The loading dock was right behind me. Usually at 5 o'clock, the big iron gate was rolled down, closing off the loading dock. Then about 5:10, I said, well, wait a minute, why is it opening again? But it wasn't opening. It was an earthquake. And I looked out of the window and I could see a brick wall across the street. And it was as if waves were going through it. I mean, something that you expect to be totally solid and immovable is actually waving around like coffee in a cup. You understand that something major is going on here.
How long did the actual quake last for?
I think it was about 42 seconds. Okay. But again, it seems like an eternity, because you have no idea how long it's going to go, or if it's going to get worse, or it's going to get this bad. The pictures can be seen in the newspapers. 2 major bridges collapsed. I mean, these are bridges that had been there for 60, 70 years, and they actually collapsed.
So this took people by surprise. I mean, the magnitude of it, and I guess it was difficult to kind of have warnings in those days to such a big earthquake.
And that's the terrifying thing about the earthquakes, is that you have no warning. Yes, there's some very sophisticated geological measurements that go on. I've yet to see one that actually predicted a major earthquake. Volcanoes, are coming. Hurricanes, are coming. Earthquakes, you have no idea. And also, you don't know if this is going to be the worst of it, because earthquakes have aftershocks, and sometimes the aftershocks are worse than the initial trembler. So you don't know if California is going to become an island, because that's one of the concerns, because you have a major fault running down the coast, and it could very possibly be, when the big one hits, as they call it in California, that the whole state will become the next Hawaii.
To put things into context, so this earthquake hits, you were in the hotel, you saw this wall moving around. Kind of what happened next?
Well, the drill is to get underneath your desk, because you have light fixtures and stuff like that hanging from the ceiling that can fall down. Or you get in the doorway, because the door frames tend to be stronger. But there was no way I could walk or crawl to the doorway. I think the building was 32 stories. Mind you, you sometimes get a false sense of security, because you think, well, I'm going to be safe underneath the desk. But if a 32-story building falls on top of you, a desk isn't going to do it.
This was a relatively new building?
Yes. It had been opened, I think, about 3 months.
And how many staff did you have in the building at that particular time, Alfie?
We had about 450. The hotel was full.
Really?
Sold out. It was the World Series baseball game, which is kind of the Super Bowl of baseball. And also there was a big convention on water and water resources. So the city was completely sold out. all the hotels, which caused some logistical problems because where do you house the staff who didn't want to go home? Maybe they didn't have home left. So we wanted to make sure we accommodated the staff. But again, that's where the team came together. Again, we were prepared for an earthquake, and we had various contingency plans already built in. The one contingency plan we didn't have built in was that this was basically predicated on the GM being there. Well, he had the great foresight of leaving on the flight to New York at 2 o'clock in that afternoon, and this hit at 5. So he was in the air, clueless as to what's going on.
Then you had to take over as the GM
Yes.
of the hotel. You were
exactly.
in charge.
So I was the leader through this crisis. Yes.
So this was your first kind of leadership role, would you say? And you were kind of accidentally kind of thrust into it?
Well, I've been managing director of a smaller boutique hotel, but this was my first experience of this scale.
So can you remember what happened next? You got a full hotel, hundreds of rooms, hundreds of staff, thousands of guests. What happened next? So this earthquake hits. The building obviously shook for a period of time, 45 seconds. There was a concern about other tremors that could be coming. Maybe there's another. There could be a big aftershock potentially as well. So what happened next? I mean, you've got so many things to grapple with. Like you've got to first make sure you're okay, that your team's okay, I presume, and then you've got to figure out what to communicate, how to communicate, et cetera, et cetera. So how did this kind of manifest itself? And I guess more importantly, kind of what was your kind of mental framework or thinking in order to kind of approach those next steps? I know it's a long time ago, but you must have had some point a pause, right? Okay, I'm going to try and take control of this. I have to do something. I need to act. People are going to be looking to me as a leader. So how did you kind of approach that?
Well, we had a procedure and a process in place. If there's a fire, we do this. If there's a flood, we do this. If there's an earthquake, we do this. So we basically followed the procedures that we'd had. They weren't really for exactly this type of earthquake, but it was a framework. So part one is the response team, emergency response team, which was the chief engineer, the chef, and basically the leadership of the hotel. We all assembled in the fire control room because that was in a very safe place. We could monitor to see if there were any fires or any smoke detectors activated or any pipes that had burst, because we get the flow indicator on the board. So again, that was a command post. So we all gathered there, and first thing to do was to find out how was the staff, any reported injuries, because we wanted to get to those first. We were very fortunate in that our chief engineer and many of his staff were firemen and had trained as firemen and medics. We had that. And also, they were used to dealing with emergencies. So I relied on them, heavily. Again, know your resources, develop those relationships way before anything happens. Then it comes into effect. Again, safety of our staff, safety of our guests, those were paramount. And so that's what we focused on. Our lifts were automatically locked down because they have to check and make sure the shafts were okay. And it took 3 days before they were able to certify them and we could use them again. So any vertical transportation, we had to use stairs.
Did you have to evacuate the building as well?
No. In fact, during earthquakes, the worst thing you can do is run out into the street because you have buildings falling into the street. And I saw, the top of the building across from me, the one that was waving, some bricks, came down, a huge section of wall came down into the street. Fortunately, there was nobody underneath there. If there's an earthquake, never go into the street, take shelter within the building is the advice.
Well, I guess that's part of the training when you're in an earthquake then, right? But you need to kind of know all this stuff.
Exactly.
Very helpful. I mean, I guess just for the audience, this was a serious earthquake. 67 people died in a very short space of time. Obviously, a lot of people on the San Francisco Bay Bridge, which collapsed. It was $5 billion of damages, US dollars of damages in that time. And obviously, that would be, if you kind of future forecast it to today's values, it's a huge amount of damage across the entire Bay Area. One of the things, obviously, was being prepared, so kind of having some kind of framework. One of the things that you touched on, which I think was really important, that the relationship side, you'd already taken time to kind of build relationships with your team before anything like this has happened. Not that you would necessarily expect, I don't think anybody expects things to happen, but you also kind of have to sometimes expect the unexpected. We've known each other for for a few years now, Alfie, and one of the things that I really appreciate is that you have a very natural and genuine approach, genuine interest in people. I think you take time to meet people and understand people, whether they're in your team or whether they're in your community. I get the impression that it's kind of your philosophy, it's your personal philosophy, your kind of personal belief system. It's who you are actually. It's kind of building these relationships on a genuine and authentic basis. Can you kind of touch on that? Because that, in my view, is so important to kind of have those relationships already intact, because at some point we're all going to go through difficult times. I mean, we didn't know we were going to go through this, particular with the coronavirus right now, but what I'm realizing is that the relationships that I built over many years, extremely important. So maybe you can touch on that, and just in terms of how you approach that. Maybe it's not so conscious, maybe it's more subconscious, but have you given any thought to how you develop your relationships when you go into a new situation?
Sure. I like to call myself a humble innkeeper. And again, to me, it's the operation is not about the GM, it's about the guest, and the staff. I'm there to make sure that everybody's walking along the same path. I think my leadership style is that very much of being a support rather than being a general. I want to, communicate a sense of calm, a sense of thinking through our actions, and involving the experts, involving the team. Because at the end of the day, they're the ones who actually live, work, and breathe what's going on. So that's why I relied heavily on the chief engineer, because he knew the building inside and out. One of the first things I asked him, I said, "How's the building?" He said, "It's in perfect shape. It's in perfect shape. All the systems are going. Our emergency generators kicked in, but we will run out of diesel fuel in 2 days." So I said, "Okay, let's get some diesel fuel." So
it's good to know.
Bring in the controller, because you're going to need cash to pay for the diesel. So knowing your resources and how to use them is essential. The other thing is, keeping focused on the mission. The mission is to take care of the guests. To complete that mission, you need the staff. You need the supplies. You need the infrastructure of the building. The focus is always on the guest. That really helps focus everybody on what needs to be done. A week or so after the earthquake and everything had settled down, I received a very nice letter from a guest, and he wanted to commend our concierge, because he said, "My pills are up in my room and I'm on the 27th floor." And the concierge said, "Not to worry, we'll get them." And he walked up 27 floors and got the medications and brought them down to the guest. Didn't tell any of us. We only heard it from the guest. That's an example of an organization that works and understands the philosophy and of taking care of the guest. That doesn't happen overnight. And that's the kind of relationships you build through time, and is hopefully how you manage your business.
I think it's critically important, because as a leader, your staff are feeling vulnerable, right? Most likely. They're worried.
Absolutely.
They're worried for not just themselves, but they're worried for their families, their friends. I think one of the first things, that I heard during this crisis was that communication went down. Because of the destruction, right? So it was very hard. Telephone lines went down, so it was very hard to communicate across buildings, across the district, for family to be called and checked if they were okay. So you have a level of uncertainty and concern and probably stress within your teams. Also, you then have all of your guests that are suddenly looking to all of your staff for answers to their questions, and they have concerns. They have people that they are worried about. Some people may have been inside the hotel, some may be outside the hotel, etc., etc. So once you gathered your kind of team together, you made sure that you set up your command center, as you called it, which is, I guess, to make sure that they're all safe. So now you can kind of run an operation. You can start to communicate, you can start to deploy. How did you kind of go from there to kind of then creating stability within the team, within the guests themselves? I presume you want to create a level of calm amongst the panic that was probably existing. How do you kind of create that wave?
Well, we were very lucky, because this hotel had amazing infrastructure, including communications. From the fire control room, I could speak to every area of the hotel, because we had the PA system that was used for fire control, but also we could use it in any circumstance. So basically, I got on PA, because you're right, we had a lot of very terrified people, especially our guests who weren't used to earthquakes. If they were coming from Chicago or someplace like that, or Houston or Dallas, they weren't accustomed to that. And it's a totally frightening experience, even if you are used to it. Communicating that everything's fine, the hotel is solid. Bear with us, and we will be in contact. And then we set up a whiteboard for the guests in the lobby and one for the staff in the staff canteen. And we say we will post information on those whiteboards and give you updates as we receive them. Because again, we had no telephones. Electricity was out, water was out, and gas was out. That was it.
Pretty much shut down. So the PA system was working, thankfully, right?
Well, that was on the emergency generator circuit. Yeah. And fortunately, this being a Japanese-built hotel, and the hotel was owned by the construction company, it was a lease. Just to give you an idea of the business ramifications of that. I mean, they still got paid, although we didn't have any revenue, but which is something else we had to think of. Communicating with them, begging to please, not bill us for the lease for that month. Communications was critical. So setting up these whiteboards was very helpful. And we basically also announced on the PA, when food service was going to be served. And we basically took everything out of the table service restaurants and moved everything into the ballroom and just did a buffet style. But also for the staff, I told the staff, if you want to go home and take care of your families, go. Just let us know where you are. Let us know how you are. Let us know what you need. I'd say maybe 15% of the staff left. The rest all stayed. And said, we will, accommodate you. We don't know where yet, but we will provide you with a place to stay and just stay for the night.
So how long did this last for, Alfie, this kind of lockdown situation, until, you could kind of get clearance, the electricity was back, the communications were back? At what point were you able to kind of release the guests from the hotel and then also the staff? And then what happened afterward? 24 hours, basically nothing positive happened. And in fact, it got worse because after the earthquake, there's one whole area of town called Marina District, which was all built on landfill. And it basically collapsed and burned because the landfill just liquefied and turned to water. Fortunately, there weren't any high rises there. And then that's where a lot of fatalities were too. But it was the fires that were prevalent from there. In fact, the smoke from the fires, although it was on the other side of the hill, I'd say about 2 miles away, the smoke was getting sucked into our air intakes because, again, we had power, so we had air conditioning. And our engineers had to basically shift where we're getting our fresh air from. So that we wouldn't get the smoke coming into our system, because there's nothing more terrifying than calling an earthquake and you smell smoke. And trapped in a building, right?
Exactly. Yeah, so that's not good news. And again, being a modern building, high rise, our windows didn't open. And we were told, don't expect any help from the police, ambulance, or fire department for 48 hours. And that's one thing that you have to anticipate when there's a major crisis, that you're on your own for, I like to say 48 hours.
Isn't that a sign of true leadership, is just taking ownership as well? Mm-hmm. It's like, I'm going to be potentially in a situation at some point in my career. I need to be kind of mentally prepared for it. And also prepared that I may not be able to reach out to anybody, just be able to kind of make it through. I mean, we haven't touched on some of the situations that you've been in, but I think there's a constant kind of theme where you've kind of been a bit stranded and you've kind of been left to kind of just take control of the situation and lead. I wonder what prepared you for that. I mean, obviously you kind of knew the drill with regards to the earthquake, but as a kind of individual, did you always feel comfortable taking that kind of position and being in that position and just making decisions? Or how did you arrive at that?
I think if you're thrust into a situation like that, I mean, it happens. And I found that in difficult times, people just step up and go for it. So I'm a great believer in human nature, people's ability to do that. Personally, again, I reflected on this. I was a member of the Cadet Corps. That's when I was at school in England, and that gave me great leadership training. I started off as a slacker, but after 2 years of being given orders, I decided I much prefer giving orders than taking orders. And eventually I ended up being the head of the Cadet Corps. So I guess there was something there. That was my motivation. I'm a avid reader. I've read all of Winston Churchill's books, and he's also, I've found, to be an inspiring leader. It's kind of the taking all those elements and that knowledge that you get from reading and also practicing to some point and having the opportunity to actually put it to use and learning from that. I'd like to think that every crisis, as you know, I've been through a few, you get a little bit smarter, and survival is important. I mean, you don't get to the next one unless you do survive.
Yeah, the reason I'm kind of smiling a bit is my first kind of leadership experience was also in the OTC or Cadet Corps, Officer Training Corps.
Yeah.
So I kind of got a taste for what you were saying. I was also in a situation where I didn't really like receiving orders, so I kind of decided to flip things around as well. But then, that's a perk, but at the same time, it becomes a responsibility. Right?
Oh, absolutely.
So Alfie, kind of going back, so things started to stabilize. You managed to start to be able to communicate with the guests. And how did you go from there? And how did you kind of make sure that everybody was okay? Everybody was kind of comfortable and on side.
Well, once we had a plan as to where people were going to eat, when they were going to eat, because we had to do it in shifts because we couldn't accommodate. I think we had a total of 900 guests, because we had 600 rooms, some double occupancy. And so we did it, in 2 different shifts to help people out. We also had to control alcohol. Sometimes people get a bit carried away with that. So we had happy hour. We served complimentary beer and wine, and then we stopped the service. They did have what was in their minibar, but that was limited.
You got to keep control of the situation, for sure.
Right.
Yeah. Bit like the governments today banning alcohol sales, right?
Right. So I understand in the UK that alcohol sales spiked, last week. But as far as communicating with the guests, most people were congregating in the lobby, just chit-chatting. So, I had to consider, should I address them all in a group? Because there was an area where I could stand and kind of oversee everybody. I said, no, everybody has their own needs and their own concerns. So, let me speak to them individually. Now, was I able to speak to everybody? No. But invariably, when I was speaking to a person, a small group gathered around it. Again, just having a consistent message. We're doing everything we can. The staff is here to help you. If you have a concern, let us know, and we'll do what we can. Someone said, well, how long are we going to be here? I said, we have no idea. The airport is closed. There's a huge crack in the runway. And the bridge leading to the airport was also cracked. So we don't know. As soon as we're able to get you out, we will get you home. And they were fine with that.
I think that's interesting, isn't it? It's just kind of like being completely honest about the situation, that actually you don't have the answers. There's nothing worse than you're in a very difficult situation. You ask questions because you need answers, and somebody gives you a vague, kind of unconfirmed answer with a maybe this and a might be that. Whereas you took the approach, we just don't know. You're just going to have to bear with us, right?
Yeah,
right?
And we're all in the same boat.
Yeah.
And this is in the days before cell phones. So people weren't able to communicate. So that was an additional hindrance. But again, we managed through it. As power came back on, I think the first thing that came back on was the telephone. We told the guests free telephone calls. This is in the days when we used to charge for long distance phone calls, exorbitant rates.
It's quite a big line item in the revenue for the P&L of the hotel, right?
Well, fortunately, this is in the days before asset managers.
Exactly.
So again, that was appreciated, but also I had to communicate not only to the staff and to the guests, to head office and the owners. And what I found was that people are very willing to help. In fact, they like being involved in being part of the solution. So I called our head office in New York, asked them, could you please contact and deal with the owners? Let them know that the building is fine, no major issues. We have a few cracked tiles here and there, but that's it. The staff is fine. And marketing, could you please, be our voice during this? Because I want to be ready for the recovery. So please contact the Japanese tour companies, that was about 30% of our business. Tell them what's going on. Tell them that their clients are safe, and tell them that they're being taken care of. And as far as new business, I said, contact the insurance companies, because they're going to be flooding the city. Tell them that we're open and we will have rooms available as soon as the flights start.
you kind of touched on a very important aspect during any crisis, but also I would say also during normal times, but even more critical now and then during a crisis is the stakeholder management piece. To put a kind of technical term on it, what you were doing there is managing all the various stakeholders to essentially make sure you get the right level of support on the one hand, but at the same time, you don't get unnecessary pressure. How did you manage that and everything else that was going on at the same time? Because you kind of got all these multiple kind of relationships. How did you kind of organize yourself from a prioritization in order to do that? The second aspect is what I thought was really compelling about the story you mentioned about mingling with the guests rather than standing up in front of them in the ballroom and giving a pre-rehearsed speech about this is what's happening and this is what we're going to be doing, kind of end of story. I thought of a much more personal approach that you took. I was just kind of curious, it must have crossed your mind to take one of or either of those two approaches. I guess that's the first part of the question. And kind of why did you opt for the one that you took? And also kind of your mental framework with dealing with all your different stakeholders, and all the relationships that you have to kind of juggle at that particular point in time. Do you have like a way of thinking that helps you kind of prioritize what to do?
Using your resources and understanding the strengths and weaknesses of each resource. For example, for contacting the head office in New York, we had a Japanese financial controller, who was basically their person on site. So I had him call and work with them because, again, they could speak the same language, they understood what was going on, and he appreciated that he was able to shine in front of his bosses because he was taking the lead on that. And, I played to that too. I understood that, and he was a perfect person to do that. And he ended up being my number 2 when I went to Hotel Nico Beverly Hills because they saw that we worked so well together. So that worked out in the long run for both of us. Yeah. I mean, it makes for very long days. Maybe I got 4 or 5 hours sleep in those first few days. But again, using those resources and trusting those resources to do what had to be done. That was the key. I mean, we had security issues because there was looting going on right outside our front door. But we had these security gates that we put down. We were able to monitor what was going on. And San Francisco has a tremendous amount of homeless. There was nobody to take care of them. There were no shelters because people were being used to shelter other people, so they were overrun. And the hotel was not supported very much by the community in San Francisco because, again, it's a very pro-union town, and we were the only non-union hotel and a major hotel that was not unionized because we believed in taking care of our staff. Our staff didn't feel the need for them, so that was held against us. But we had very close relationships with a church 1 block over from us, Glide Memorial, which was very much focused on taking care of the homeless. One of the early calls I made was to Reverend Cecil. He was quite a character. And I said, this is our situation. We're fine. How can we help you? He said, we just need some food. We have no food. All our food's gone. I said, okay. We loaded up a truck, just basically sent them a bunch of food. They were so grateful for that. And he went on the radio and told the city what we'd done. So it wasn't us saying, this is what we did. It was the person receiving it. And he was a very much a loved character in San Francisco. Unintended benefit, but you take the benefits when you can. And also, when the looters started coming, he and some of his congregation came over and said, don't touch these people. They're helping us.
Interesting.
I mean, we had these steel shutters down, so they couldn't have gotten in anyway, but they were banging on it and making all kinds of hullabaloo. But we had security cameras so we could see what was going on. So that's what we called in for assistance with that. It's amazing how cooperative people tend to get.
We've spent a lot of time as a company focused on community. Actually, we labeled 2020 as the year of community. Little did we know that actually the community aspect to what's going on today with the coronavirus is absolutely enormous and absolutely critical, not only to our well-being as human beings, but I think also as our well-being as a society and our well-being as a, you could argue, even broader economy. What was interesting there was the reach out, because when we look at communities, we talk about what's called an in community and an out community. An in community is community that's kind of self-contained. So in that particular instance, your hotel would be an example of an in community. And what it means is it's not fully integrated within the community outside. And you kind of gave the example that it was actually kind of held separately because you weren't part of the unions. And you kind of have a separation between in and out community. But actually, the ultimate communities are where those barriers are broken down and you have a seamless interaction between the in community and the out community. And it's fully accepted. Whether it's a church, whether it's a hotel, whether it's whatever it is, you can kind of make that extrapolation. And what was interesting here was you reached out to the community with regards to the memorial church that was looking after the homeless. You had so many other things going on that you were trying to deal with. What was it that made you want to do that? You know, I mean, I can understand the whole city's in chaos, but is it kind of a personal aspect that you wanted to do this? And can you remember what your state of mind was that triggered you to kind of reach out?
It wasn't my idea. It was our human resources director's idea. No, I can't take credit for that. I made the phone call, but it was her idea. And again, this is where the benefit of working with a strong team really comes to the forefront. You're getting all these different ideas, thoughts, ways of handling things from the team.
I guess the rationale was, look, we're in a pretty good position here. We've managed to contain the situation. We've got everything under control. Now what can we do? Because the city's pretty much falling apart, right? And it was a case of, well, this is our city. I mean, you live there. You're part of the community. We want to kind of help our city recover. I guess that was part of the mentality of your human resources director and your team in terms of wanting to reach out.
Exactly. Because we heard after the fact that a lot of the looters were going to hotels because hotels were basically ditching food that had been in their refrigerators. They didn't have emergency power. It was going to waste. They just threw it out, which is, I think that could have been handled differently too.
Basically, that period kind of came to an end. Obviously, there was a lot of rebuilding that was required in San Francisco. You know, I understand as a consequence to this, you were then promoted to general manager at the Hotel Nico in Beverly Hills. This played a major part in terms of how you handled the situation and the confidence that the company had in you as a leader. And now you go from kind of one experience of a crisis to another one. I mean, you probably thought you were escaping. Yeah, you're not, no more earthquake. Go to Los Angeles. Everything should be fine. It's great weather. There's lots of celebrities and there's going to be loads of parties. It's going to be a great lifestyle. So give us a little bit of a flavor for what Beverly Hills was like in those days. And also kind of your role as a GM, having traveled around different parts of the world where general management positions are extremely highly regarded in the community. And I can only imagine back then, you know, being in charge of that hotel is probably the same. Maybe just give a picture of kind of what your lifestyle was like back then in Beverly Hills before the riots kind of kicked off.
Well, they do have a few earthquakes in Los Angeles, but the sunshine was great. Yes, there were a lot more stars and not just at night running around. So definitely a fun part. And our grand opening was certainly star-studded. But getting to that point was a challenge because I arrived in Los Angeles 2 years before the hotel opened. And when I got there, it was just a giant hole in the ground. The hole was 4 floors deep and one full city block. So my first question is, why does a 300-room hotel need this much? We have more floors going down than we going up. There wasn't enough parking, and then with all the street parking taken up, so they said you have to have, I think it was 750 parking spaces for a 300-room hotel. You know, we were also restricted to no more than 80 people in our ballroom, no breakout rooms. I mean, all kinds of restrictions. Essentially, they didn't want the hotel to be viable, so it wouldn't be built.
It's all in the wrong proportion, isn't it?
Well, I think Nico is the only one who actually, because they were desperate to have a hotel in Los Angeles, so they went with it. But the ownership structure was also interesting because it was 49% owned by Kawasaki Steel, a very conservative Japanese company. To them, short-term planning was from 0 to 500 years. And then a investment group out of New York owned another 49%, and 2% was owned by Nico. Hence, Nico had a deciding vote between the Kawasaki Steel and the New York investors. They couldn't agree what day it was, let alone on complex business decisions. So invariably, there were interesting owners' meetings. Not only was I managing the hotel, but I was also representing, because invariably the night before the ownership meetings, I'd get a call from New York saying, Alphy-san, unfortunately, I can't make the meeting. Please represent us to the best of your ability.
That's a nice pass on, isn't it?
Yeah. So I did. So before the meeting, both parties loved me. After the meeting, one party loved me, one party hated me.
Absolutely, because you always had to side with one or the other, right? very strong position to be in.
So, there's still a lot of design issues. And the other challenge was that half the hotel was in Beverly Hills, half the hotel was in Los Angeles. So 2 different building codes, 2 different zoning entities who had to decide, what can be built and what couldn't be built. So half the hotel was 3-story, the other half was 5-story. LA was 5-story, Beverly Hills was 3-story. Architecturally, it was a challenge. And also, just one example, they come up with this new fluorescent floor stripping for corridors to indicate which way the fire exits were. Because typically, all the signage for fire exits is hung from the ceiling, where you can't see them when they smoke.
That's true.
You crawl along the floor. That's why the airlines now put all the signage on the floor. So we pioneered that in Los Angeles. Never be a pioneer, because LA loved it, Beverly Hills hated it. So half the hotel had it, the other
half on the floor,
did.
Half on the ceiling.
Yes, exactly. We put it in anyway, because the fire marshal came and said, why is this here? I said, do you want to explain to people why their loved ones were killed in a fire because they couldn't get to the exits, and the other ones all survived? And also dealing with the neighborhood association, who were ardently against this project. And what compounded it, there was some racist overtones too, being a Japanese company. So I was very much the face of the company, because here I was, an American, managing a Japanese-owned hotel, half-owned hotel, managed hotel. So I had a lot of dealings with the neighborhood associations, which meant a lot of lunches at expensive restaurants with them and listening to their rants. But again, they just wanted somebody who would listen and pay attention to them. So LA is a nice area. I have family there.
So you've got a complex project, right?
Mm-hmm.
In all different facets by the sounds of it. You've got shareholdings, you've got the building itself, you've got the municipalities, you've got different legal requirements. Then obviously at the same time, you managed to get the hotel operational, and the hotel was open during the riots. So
we'd opened 2 weeks before.
So you were 2 weeks open. As you said, you kind of prepared yourself for earthquakes in California,
right,
but not in terms of riot.
Correct. Although purely by coincidence, because my dad was working for Pan Am in Europe, and we decided to go to Disneyland, as most little kids do. Parents take their kids. And we happened to be in Los Angeles when they had the Watts riots. So riots in LA, to me, they were, okay, so what's unusual about this? But we didn't expect this occurrence. We kind of had a hint. The fire spread so fast, and this riot spread so fast that the police just was not able to handle it. And also the police were seen as the bad guys. It didn't matter that the mayor of Los Angeles, and he'd been mayor for, I think, 8 years, was a black man. But he rose through the ranks of being a policeman. So he was not seen as a black person. He was seen as a policeman.
I think for the listeners that might not be so familiar with this event, which occurred in 1992, it's also known as the Rodney King riots, was the man you were referring to, who was actually at the center of this controversy in terms of the outcome from the court proceedings. I think there was obviously such an undercurrent of tension within society. Just some statistics here, which are pretty shocking. There were basically more than 100 fires. The riots were over 5 days. They left 50 people dead, 2,000 people injured. 1,000 buildings were destroyed in the Los Angeles area, with damage over $1 billion within those 5 days. Protesters were basically blocking traffic. They were taking motorists out of their vehicles, beating them up. I think at that particular point in time, Los Angeles was one of the largest hotel markets by the looks of it. It's 86,000 rooms in those days. It was a big market. There was a lot of activity in that market. A lot of people coming from all over the place. Take us through what actually happened to the hotel when the riots happened. Where were you? What was going on? How did that impact the staff and the guests? Los Angeles was in a dip anyway in terms of occupancy. There was already a decline in the market. So this obviously exacerbated that situation dramatically. So it was over a 5-day period that this happened. So it must have been absolute chaos.
Oh, it was. It really struck home because I decided I can only see so far to see what's happening. So I went to the roof of the hotel and kind of surveyed what was happening around. And the one thing that struck me was all these plumes of smoke rising in specific small areas. I was with our security and I said, what is it that's causing these plumes of smoke? He said, well, they're setting fire to gasoline stations or petrol stations. The disturbing thing was that these plumes of smoke were slowly marching towards us, getting closer and closer. The closest one was about half a mile away.
Basically thick black smoke coming off petrol.
Yes, but yeah, it was kind of an indicator as to which direction these riots were heading. It was heading straight for us. The kind of modus operandi was that the angry youth were getting into cars and pickup trucks, loading up with Molotov cocktails and driving around, throwing them places. Somebody suggested that, these rioters are crazy because they were burning all their own neighborhoods. So then I guess the rioters said, oh, yeah, that's a good point. Let's go some other neighborhoods. So Beverly Hills was right next to us. That's where we went. And standing on the top, we could see carfuls of youths throwing these Molotov cocktails around the place. We were surrounded by a wall, but we had an entrance to the driveway and an exit to the driveway. When the director of security, we decided, okay, we need to block these because it would be easy for a car to pull in, throw the Molotov cocktails into our lobby, and exit. About a block away from us was a luxury car rental place, any kind of luxury cars. And they're just parked in the forecourt. I knew Jan, who was the owner and manager of the place. He called me up and he said, Alfie, yeah, I have $1 million worth of inventory sitting in my forecourt here. And I have these crazy people torching stuff. Can I come park them in your parking lot, which is underground? We have 700 spaces.
Yeah,
we have lots of
plenty of space.
So I said, bring them over. I said, but do you have access to a large, heavy van, preferably two, that I can park in front of our entrance and block it off so that people can't drive in? He said, yep, you got it. So once all the cars were in, parked the vans across the driveway. And if somebody needed to come in, we had a code for flashing lights that we knew it was somebody that we had to open up for and then quickly close it again. So that taking care of the staff because we had a mixed race staff, but everybody got along fine because again, we focused on the guests. We closed the restaurants that were facing La Cienega Boulevard, which is a major thoroughfare, and also moved all the guests in our courtyard rooms because, again, we didn't want lights showing or any evidence. We turned our Nico Hotel sign off. We'd only just opened, so people were used to it being dark. So we just pretended we weren't open yet. And we fed all the guests in the ballroom, no windows, because, again, a lot of smashed windows. So that was happening too. There was no outside assistance available from the police, the ambulance, or the fire department. And they told us, you're on your own. You have to take care of yourselves. We're overwhelmed. We developed a good relationship with Cedar Sinai Hospital, which is about 2 blocks away. And so I called up the director and I said, you might have some of your staff who don't want to drive around. They're welcome to come and stay with us, no charge. Because I figured that we would get the benefit of having medical staff. We didn't have that otherwise. He said, great, thank you so much. I didn't think about that. We were going to put them in hospital beds, but we're full. So he did that. And he graciously called Beverly Hills because he was totally in Beverly Hills. And because you have Beverly Hills-based employees there, I'm going to ask Beverly Hills Police to also protect your building.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so it worked. Yeah, on both sides.
Again, mutual benefit. That was terrific. And, so I kept in touch with Larry for a long time. So.
But there's a common element here to what you're saying. I mean, that the reach out is so important. I guess it can be counterintuitive during a crisis like this. Mm-hmm. And I think what's interesting, we're getting stories back during the coronavirus at the moment where, hospitals are reaching out to hotel establishments, not just for quarantine measures, but also to house their own doctors and nurses because they're working such long shifts. Mm-hmm. They need somewhere to sleep. They don't want to risk essentially having an impact on maybe friends or family, whoever they're staying with at home. I think when you're having it both ways, where the hotel management and leaders are reaching out to the community and kind of saying, look, we're in a good place, actually. How can we help? And then obviously that relationship that kind of mutually beneficial from that regard, where you ended up having the support from the police department as well for the hotel to protect the health workers from the hospital. I guess I can understand it. If you're in a crisis, you're probably locked into your own kind of mode of thinking, which is kind of all about protection. Like I've got to protect my own interests. I've got to protect my immediate family. I've got to protect my immediate employees. Very few people necessarily go beyond that. So how were you able to go beyond that kind of frame of thinking and constantly think about reaching out into the community? Well,
my philosophy is that the hotel is part of the community. So it really starts way in the beginning. Yeah. And that's important to be part of that community and to see how you can be of assistance. And it's helpful if you build those relationships before the crisis hits, because after that, it's sometimes regarded as disingenuous. one of the benefits of having the Beverly Hills Police there was that we had a guest, a Japanese guest, elderly gentleman. He and his wife must have been in their 70s, and he had to go for his walk every day. And he got tired of walking just in the hotel. He says, I want to walk on the street. We chatted with the Beverly Hills Police patrol car that was parked outside the hotel and told him the situation. The policeman kind of looked at us incredulously. He said, does he know how dangerous it is? He said, we tried to explain it, but no. I said, okay, have him come out and I will just drive behind him. As he's walking down the sidewalk with his wife, I'll be right there with him. So again, we made one guest very happy, and apparently that made the news in Japan. That didn't hurt, but again, you don't think about what kind of benefit you can get from that. We were just taking care of the guests' quirky needs.
Absolutely.
You touched basically quickly on family. I'd just like to emphasize on that a little bit because, family is so important because, I've had the benefit of having a wonderful wife who very able to take care of herself and support me. But you have to think care of other people's families too, because if you're worried about what's happening with your family, then you can't really focus on what you need to be doing. So that's why my philosophy has always been family first. Take care of your family, and then whatever you can do, we're grateful for.
It's maybe more apparent today, the importance of family and relationships. But you mentioned it in your keynote speech in Houston, which I managed to find in the archives, which I think was around, let's say, circa 20 years ago. You were a young man then. Not that you're not a young man.
Did they have film in those days?
One of the things that you resonated then was that you had seen so many situations of expats traveling around the world into different positions of leadership. The majority of failed leadership positions that you had seen, I think you cited something like 40%, maybe even higher, 50%, was due to the unhappiness of the spouse or the lack of support by the spouse or partner or significant other, I think were the words you exactly used. And in supporting that move, that situation, that role, that stress, I think it can't be underlined enough how important that is. I did my executive MBA about, 15, 20 years ago now. It was with Kellogg in the US and also in Germany here in Europe. And one of the US professors, he was an organizational expert. He's also focused on leadership. And he said, if I can give you any advice, one key takeaway, you've got another 2 years that are going to be completely grueling. You've got to manage this among your other positions, your family, your responsibilities, your work, everything else. And he said, if I can give you any advice, just make sure that the person that supports you in your life is absolutely committed and behind you and supportive of what you're doing. Because if they're not, you're going to really struggle. Interestingly enough, there were a few people that dropped out of the program, and all of them because they didn't have the support of their family. I guess that is kind of so critical in any role in leadership, is to have the support, but also as a leader to make sure that those people can support their families, because as you mentioned, if they can't, then it's a very, very difficult situation. We have flexible working in our company, and during the crisis, at the very beginning of the crisis, one of our team members, she was in Berlin and she was worried for her father, who's in Madrid. And she said, I really just need to be able to kind of get back to Madrid within the next 24 hours. I think they're going to shut the city down. And I said, look, absolutely, you can work from anywhere. You can work as little as you want or as much as you want. Don't worry, just jump on that plane, get yourself organized, get back, make sure everything's okay at home. I think that ability to be able to do that as an employer, and obviously we've seen many employers do that now, but it kind of didn't come naturally to them. I mean, it's something we've been living with for 5 years. We've always been putting kind of the personal aspect first in terms of our whole team. How did your management style kind of make sure that your team was okay? How did you find out if there were any issues at home or if there were any concerns? I mean, aside from these kind of major events, because you've got critical situation here where there's a riot going on. Obviously, people are concerned for their families and friends. You want to make sure they're okay. There are other times, I mean, probably just business as usual, where you've got your team, your staff, who are also worried. Maybe there's somebody sick at home. Maybe there's somebody in a difficult situation financially. How, as a leader or a manager, did you put yourself in a position where you were able to understand what was going on within your team, or did you not know what was going on within your team? It's okay in a time of crisis, people are more likely to say, I've got a challenge. But maybe when it's business as usual, maybe somebody's not going to mention their father's sick and they need to be taking care of them. and it's having an impact on their work?
I tend to listen more than I speak. And when you're chatting with people, these relationships just don't turn on when there's a crisis. You build these relationships as you go. And hopefully you get to having a sense of mutual respect with the staff that if they are in trouble, that they're able to discuss it. Not always the case, absolutely not, but maybe you hear it from somebody else who wants to support them. And again, it's just making sure that you're listening to what's going on and seeing what's going on. I mean, if somebody has an alcohol problem, which happens fairly frequently in our business, especially in the past, I think not as much anymore. That used to be a huge issue. And how do you address that? I had a situation when I was with Rosewood that we had one GM who was spending a lot of time in the bar, sensibly to client relations. So I had to sit him down and say, these are the facts. These are your bar bills. On the register, it says what time that check was open and what time it was closed. Confronting people with the facts and offering a solution. That's the key. Making sure that they understand that they're not in this alone. And sometimes it needs somebody to point to them that they do actually have a problem.
I think it keeps coming back to just being transparent in your approach as well. Mm-hmm. We've kind of talked about it before, the need for authentic leadership based on the HoCoSo Connect discussion that we had. The characteristics that you're talking about is all around really about authenticity.
Absolutely. And also, kind of the old school is that the GM was king of the hotel. I've never subscribed to that. I've seen that probably in my early years in the business. I saw how destructive that was. Yeah. So basically doing the opposite of that and saying, no, the guest is king in this hotel.
Well, Alfie, I think that's a really nice note to end on. I think that your role, the humble innkeeper, is really understated, but I think it also encapsulates your philosophy to kind of how you look after people, how you look after your family, your stakeholders, your guests, your team. It's definitely not an accurate description of all of the things that you've been party to and you've achieved in your life. But at the same time, I think this is one of the reasons I really wanted to do the podcast with you, because having had several conversations with you, I mean, we've only covered like 1/10 of the material that we have in front of us in an hour and a bit. There's so much richness that you could share with our audiences and would be beneficial to leaders of the future and of today. And interestingly, what you mentioned about that you hadn't prescribed to the old kind of hierarchical model of general management is you adopted a style of management that is, I think, what management and leaders are looking to do today, but you've been doing it pretty much your whole career, which I think is just really remarkable. So I just wanted to kind of say a big thank you for being our first podcast.
Yes, well, and thank you, Jonathan. This has been a great opportunity. It's really helped me reflect further. My ambition now is to basically share what I've learned and share those experiences and kind of adopt the role of a modern elder, to use Chip Conley's term, because that's what I really feel my position in life is now, is to help share those experiences so that other people can learn from them, whether they're good, bad, or ugly. So thank you.
It's an absolute pleasure, Alfie. And I hope this is a start of a journey that we can continue together of sharing these wonderful insights. So thank you very much indeed.
No, thank you.